I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, good and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participants movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Pernico, a host of this podcast, and this week I'm just the host of the podcast this week. That's all I'm saying.
That's good. I'm Dean Detloff, and I'm the co-host of the podcast this week.
I should have said co-host. I said host like I'm the only person, and that's wrong.
No, I think this time around, you're the host and I am the co-host. And
I'm hosting.
It couldn't be better. That's right.
Okay. It's like I'm hosting Saturday Night Live. This is my opening monologue, and the whole bit is here that I didn't know I was the host. So that's cool.
Yeah, that's right. It's a real Alec Baldwin kind of night.
And Pete Davidson's in the crowd, and he is gonna laugh no matter what happens.
Pete's wild for this Marxism stuff.
He loves it. Keenan,
he's got that
into
Staten
it too.
Staten Island working class sensibility.
Man, I hope Saturday Night Live never comes back on.
I hope it comes back on, but only with Pete Davidson and Kenan Thompson.
Yeah, that's true. Kenan Thompson is my fave. I've loved him since all that.
Yep.
I'll never stop, really.
We are not talking about SNL. We're not talking about Kenan, unfortunately. Instead, we're talking about an essay and an idea. I'll start with the idea. That sounds more exciting. We're talking about the idea of solidarity, the very possibility of such a thing. But to do that, we're talking about an essay by David Roediger, who's a really great labor historian and Marxist theorist and anti-racist historian who has a collection of essays called Class, Race, and Marxism. And one of the essays in it is called Making Solidarity Uneasy, Cautions on a Keyword from Black Lives Matter to the Past. It's a really interesting article because it does exactly what it says. It makes solidarity uneasy, but as we'll see, not for that reason unachievable or unimportant. So lots of great nuances in this particular essay.
Yeah. Well, since I'm the host, let me just introduce it like this. You might be wondering, well, okay, solidarity. Why would you want to make it uneasy at all? Well, let me tell you a little bit why. This past week on July 20th, there was a big strike across the United States, and it was in some other countries too. Imagine that. It was called the Strike for Black Lives. The strike was organized mostly by SEIU, but there's a coalition of other unions and other activist groups that were, working on it to make sure it all happened. And after all was said and done, workers went on strike in something like 160 cities. It was massive as far as a big strike goes. The goal of the strike was to draw attention to the pressing labor issues of the day, which we're all very familiar with at this point, I guess, like minimum wage, paid sick leave, proper protective equipment for workers, and so on. But the strike also paid some special attention to the ways that race and class go hand in hand. How, you can't talk about economic inequality if you don't talk about racial inequality too. That's good. I don't know. But for all of us who weren't on strike, it's like a moment and a time to stand in solidarity with these workers. And solidarity is one of those big ideas on the left, like Dean was saying a minute ago, that we use quite a bit. But what does solidarity actually mean? How does it work? How do we do a solidarity in general? Is it posting about it? Is it using the right hashtag? Does it mean marching with people? Does it mean holding common sentiments together? Does it mean just wanting the same things? Does it just mean empathy? What could any of these things mean, really? So, in this episode, we're going to take a closer look at the idea of solidarity and some of its complicated histories. And I think by kind of understanding the histories and kind of understanding like the criticisms about certain types of solidarity and certain types of historical moments, we can kind of come to understand like what's going on a little bit better in our current situations and like how we can comport ourselves better to being better practitioners of solidarity. As
Hmm.
people who are on the left or people who are Christians, it's really important to understand how to like come alongside people, and I think that we can learn a lot by understanding how people have done it wrongly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also great to reflect on something like solidarity because it's one of those words that like everybody loves, and rightly so, right? We all love it. Solidarity, you should love it, you should want it, you should try to achieve it, all that kind of stuff. You want to be in solidarity with other people. It's a good word, but it's also a word that can hide a lot of differences that are significant differences. It can sort of obscure them or paper over them or pretend that they don't matter when in fact perhaps not only do they matter but they prevent you from having real solidarity. And I think this is kind of a theme that comes up on this show a lot with respect to Christianity, and it's interesting to see a similar problem in the labor movement in particular. That problem is the problem of something like universality, or trying to achieve a unity based on, in this case, a common struggle in Christianity, something like a particular faith tradition or something like that. But I think there's a similar way that these kind of aspirations that might seem good, and maybe in many cases, of course, are good, nevertheless can end up creating their own kinds of particularisms that are actually violent, but they sort of hide behind um, ideas of the universal. If you're interested in where we talk about that on the show, we talk about it with Maria Armstrong a few times. Marika Rose also brings our attention to it, and some other people as well. But we've never really done it in the labor movement, I don't think. So I think this will be a good way to maybe draw some connections. So let me start out with a quote from Roediger, kind of putting this all on the table. He says, Solidarity's magnificent association with the good fights is well established in its recent past. To encourage an unease with the magic seemingly worked by such a word is therefore perilous. It risks being misheard as defeatism and resignation in the face of division, rather than as an appeal for sober reflection on the difference that differences make, even in how unity is apprehended. Nevertheless, the magnificence of solidarity can hardly be realized if it is tethered to impossible expectations, leaving us coming up forever short of an unexamined ideal. What I love about this approach is that Roediger isn't saying that you shouldn't have solidarity or shouldn't try to get it, but you shouldn't pretend that getting solidarity is something very easy to do. And if you do that, if you make that mistake, you'll never even get there. You'll never get to the good stuff of solidarity. So just a great reminder that we should be careful as on the left.
It's a good reminder. You gotta be reminded of this thing particularly. Um, well, I think that's a good way to start us out. But the next thing that Rudiger does is start bringing up ways that solidarity happens or how it doesn't happen. How like sometimes the connections are sort of unusual, but like when they're made, they're very meaningful. So here's another quote, and we'll talk about maybe a specific example of problem of solidarity in a minute. But okay, here's another quote from Rudiger. Looking as well at the forms of solidarity that emerged after the killing of Mike Brown underscores another dimension of the difficulties involved in arriving at a sober assessment of the phenomenon of solidarity. We confront, that is, not only the question of our own desire, but also perhaps an erratic pattern of ways in which solidarity actually comes and fails to come into the world. In at least two particular areas, Black Palestinian solidarity and Black queer solidarity, the dramatic successes after Ferguson seemed almost simple in their triumphs, a matter of showing up and reaching out and waiting. And yet, other efforts at solidarity, such as trade union solidarity with the victims of white supremacist police violence, solidarity proceeds excruciatingly slowly and not always forward. I think this is interesting because I don't know, the places that you might expect solidarity to happen, like I don't know, a trade union, or a labor union. It seems like that would be like a pretty easy spot for these kind of things to form, right? Like the rank and file of some like low wage but unionized jobs like food service or like grocery store workers or whatever, are oftentimes people of color, and you think that those lines of solidarity would be like, really quick to form because like that's the rank and file after all. But there are ways that just like doesn't happen, and we're seeing that kind of replay out. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. Sometimes solidarity happens just in places you wouldn't directly expect, right? Like the connection between Ferguson and Palestine is not, it's a line that you have to take some time to draw, but it's there in an interesting way.
Yeah, and not only is it there in an interesting way, but as Roediger says, it was there in almost a simple way, right? Just showing up, reaching out, and waiting. Roediger goes into greater detail about how those forms of solidarity actually emerged. So it's not like he's just like, look, these ones are easy and the institutional ones are hard. There are particular contours to them. But I think it's really useful that he kind of makes the suggestion that if we're going to talk about solidarity, we have to understand how it gets used and how it also gets sort of abused. So, for instance, like he notes in particular the ways that like institutional labor can't seem to mobilize in the right way or immediately in response to racialized violence or the killing of Black people in the streets by police. Because they also feel some kind of bizarre solidarity with police unions because they're part of the AFL or something, AFL-CIO. And I think it's just good to recognize that having conversations about solidarity might not only unify you in some ways, but it might pit you against certain segments of the left in other ways. And that's like a really, really tough thing to sort out, but very important rather than pretending that it's an easy thing to do.
Right. Well, here's an example of the complication. So this is written, not right now, in the past, and the example of Mike Brown kind of shows you the date that we're working with here. But um, this is what Roediger says about labor and cops, and kind of how he outlines the narrative around the institutionalized like labor unions and how this works out, during the first protest in Ferguson, not the most recent ones. Okay, so Roediger says the heralded statement on Ferguson by the AFL-CIO head Richard Trumka turned out to offer a re-acknowledgement of the position that police unions are labor unions just like any other. As Trumka put it, this is a quote from Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, in case you didn't know. The AFL-CIO, by the way, is a big it's like the managing head of like labor unions that kind of knits all these different labor unions together. It's a thing. Okay. Anyways, this is what Richard Trumka says. Leslie McSpadden, Michael Brown's mother, who works at a grocery store, is our sister, an AFL-CIO union member. And Darren Wilson, the officer who killed Mike Brown, is a union member's son, is a union member too, and he is our brother. Our brother killed our sister's son, and we do not have to wait for the judgment of prosecutors or courts to tell us how terrible this is. That's the quote from Richard Trumka. It's very confusing. And then Roediger goes on to say, mobilization of membership by the AFL-CIO for demonstrations in solidarity with Mike Brown was unsurprisingly meager. So I guess like what's important to draw out here is that, okay, Richard Trumka, this guy who's the president of all of these labor unions, the AFL-CIO, and he's on the one hand we have this woman who is our union sister, and on the other hand we have this guy who's our union brother, and like this like whole family analogy is so like absolutely bizarre, but like because Trumka like frames it in this way, that these are both just workers who these things have happened to, like all we can do is say how terrible it is, and that like prohibits him from doing the work of solidarity. And in response, the AFL-CIO demonstrations weren't exactly great for Mike Brown, and we see the same exact thing playing out right now. The moment, I don't know how involved everyone is in the discourse of labor on Twitter or elsewhere on social media, but these conversations have kind of reemerged about police unions. In case you don't know, um, there's a really good article that Kim Kelly, I don't know if you know her, she's a good labor reporter,
Hmm.
but she has written a lot about police unions lately, just a ton. She's kind of always on the beat, and I appreciate that about her. She wrote a piece a while back in Teen Vogue, which is cool. And it was called "Police Unions: What to Know and Why They Don't Belong in the Labor Movement." And she kind of the whole thing is like is a really good sort of explainer if you don't know. So go read Teen Vogue. I don't know. Teen Vogue is where all the good radical stuff is these days. So I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how to process that information in my brain, but okay, it's pretty cool. Anyway, so this is what Kim Kelly writes, just kind of like a really quick summarization of like what's going on right now. In a statement that also called for the resignation of Minneapolis Police Union President Bob Kroll, the AFL-CIO, this is the right now, Richard Trumka is still the president, but whatever. The AFL-CIO instead called for the reform of police unions and policing, insisting that the answer was to engage police unions rather than to isolate them. And then she says, meanwhile, smaller locals and member unions have been making their own stances clear and keeping up the pressure. Rank and file members of various unions are brainstorming ways to push their leadership into action. So I guess like the whole reason I want to draw this out though is that it demonstrates the way that sometimes solidarity is like slow but also confused.
Hmm.
That these places where you think solidarity should be, like labor. I mean, the example we started the show off with, the strike for Black Lives, right? It's about calling out not just uh, economic inequality, but also racial inequality. Like that's an expression of solidarity, but in the larger structure of the labor movement in the United States, this has been like painfully slow, very confusing, and also contradictory, right? Where the AFL-CIO at the very top, those folks will say one thing that, well, they're just workers like anybody else, whatever. All the like at the local levels, smaller unions, local unions, etc., have been way more vocal about trying to get the leadership of the national unions to like oust police from stop representing them basically. And yeah, I don't know, it's a good example of the ways that the labor union works against itself, the way that solidarity can work against itself, the way that these topics become very complicated.
Yeah, I mean it's great to point that out, right? It's just put simply, it's the weaponization of solidarity by one kind of institutional arm of the labor movement against the weaponization of solidarity by certain rank and file people in the labor movement. Which is all to say that you don't want to collapse those kind of distinctions in some kind of imaginary peaceful higher solidarity where everybody just gets along, right? Like where you have all the big union family comes together for the big family reunion, and everybody feels good about it, like they're all part of the big old labor family. I think it's important to sort of break that kinship analogy and understand that solidarity is something that you earn and sort of strive to achieve and re-earn over time. You can't really like take it for granted just because you're in a movement ostensibly built on solidarity.
That's right. In the most recent sort of wave of protests around George Floyd and his murder, um, in Washington D.C., there was this moment where people were kind of upset that the AFL-CIO building in Washington D.C. was it got tagged. People spray painted "All cops are bastards" on it, and you know, and they broke like windows or whatever. And in response, the AFL-CIO folks were like, okay, um, like what if we said Black Lives Matter on the building? So they painted a big Black Lives Matter mural, and that's in a way that's a way of saying solidarity with these protests, right? Saying Black Lives Matter is a way of saying solidarity right now, and it didn't really help them. It didn't really help them. It didn't ring true, right? Like just like you were saying, that solidarity like wasn't earned. It was just
Hmm.
like, just saying it doesn't mean it's true. Showing up for somebody is sometimes it's hard to tell exactly like what showing up for somebody might look like, right? Like it can look like a lot of different things. Like maybe sometimes saying it is like enough, and sometimes you have to do more, or show up in different ways. And I think what's clear is that like boarding up your windows and putting a Black Lives Matter mural on your building is not the same as showing up for people in that moment. So, I mean, the AFL-CIO is trying to, I think, like do what it can in this moment, but I think it is also severely confused in the way it's responding.
Yeah.
So yeah, all of that to say that like solidarity is complicated, and sometimes just saying it isn't enough.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is a great way to also talk about how Christians get stuck on these sorts of problems. I mean, we talked I don't know, maybe it was like a month ago or a couple months ago now about labor and capital and all that kind of stuff, and how Christians just have sometimes a hard time understanding what the what the productive forces are in a society, or like why you would care about them. And we sometimes as Christians eclipse those questions with appeals to things like loving our neighbor or acts of mercy or something, and we sort of ignore these material issues underneath. I think solidarity is actually a great example of how that happens a lot,
Yeah.
because Christians will use that word, right? And one thing that's really fascinating about this essay is Roediger makes this argument that in some ways Christians didn't invent the word, but they like set a tone for it, which doesn't go away, I don't think. So Roediger says the origin of the term solidarity and even its usage into the 19th century are surprisingly entwined with impulses that, if not conservative, are seemingly at odds with the left uses of the word so common today. Well into the 19th century, the Catholic Church, not radicals, deployed solidarity most effectively, being better poised to survive repression and more able to combine a critique of bourgeois individualism with a hankering for older pre-industrial regimes of rule, including at times even royalism. Roediger doesn't mention this, but like this is basically the, I think, driving sentiment behind like Rerum Novarum, right? Some of the labor encyclicals, papal encyclicals. And it's also a certain driving sentiment that's still with us today, right? I think about like, I don't know, Matt, if you've heard of the American Solidarity Party. Does that mean anything to you?
No.
That's fine. I won't go into it. I should have, when we were thinking about this episode, I should have done more research on it and brought it to you earlier, but, it just occurred to me right now in this conversation. It's a political party that is based on, in sort of like Catholic social teaching in the United States, and it comes out of certain distributist ideas. You know, it's not totally homogenous, but it's a kind of like Catholic left of center sort of movement. And the fact that it's called the American Solidarity Party, I think, is just such a great illustration of this, because they'll often position themselves against Marxism or communism, right? They go out of their way to say that's not what we're about. What we're really about is building solidarity in this kind of Christian way. And you know, it's not like they're like totally reducible to Christianity, I guess. I don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But in my experience, the only people I ever see talk about it are Christians, which is telling in itself. And in any case, all that to say, it's an interesting example of how the Christian use of the term solidarity has continued till today in a way that is not always bad, right? Like when Dorothy A talks about being in solidarity with the working class, she's not doing that as a Marxist. And like sometimes I wish that she did. But obviously what she achieves with it is still very impressive and good. But nevertheless, solidarity is a term that people can hide behind in order to reproduce anti-communist or anti-proletarian sentiments, not to mention all kinds of ways that people use solidarity to say that they're for something like, let's say, an anti-racist movement in the streets, but in fact, they, you know, don't put up in the way that they should. So all that to say, Christians have, I think, particular reasons to use this word, and Christian leftists have particular reasons to be like suspicious of it in the ways that Roediger helps us understand.
So solidarity has some roots in Christianity and Catholicism, and I think that's always really interesting connection for our show. But I think as the word stands, most of us know it when it, you know, in regards to labor. And Roediger goes on to say a little bit more about how that all happened. So he says, in the second half of the 19th century, the connection between solidarity and labor became firm for the first time at the level of both practice and theory. Ironically, Marxist practice, far more than Karl Marx's theoretical writings, spread the use of solidarity, often in its English rather than its French form, which meant across national boundaries. So there's the term there, not necessarily in Marx himself, but in Marx's praxis. And that's, I guess, pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think there's a lot to say about Marx and solidarity. There's a lot of ideas that Marx has that kind of like makes glances at what we would know as solidarity, but he says them in different ways because I think the language wasn't quite there for him or something.
Mm-hmm.
But like
Mm-hmm.
species being, there's a sense of solidarity there, but also one that kind of covers over difference, you know, the sense
Mm-hmm.
of like all being human. But there's also other types of solidarity that you get in Marx too, just in his conception of like you know, like the ways that workers can come together to I mean, you know, basically have a revolution. But like, but Marx himself never talks about it so much, or at least not as explicitly as other people do.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny. Roediger says, I mean, for all you sociology history heads out there, Roediger says that it's actually like Durkheim more than Marx who
Right.
takes the time to like sort out what this word means and what it does, all that kind of stuff, which is pretty interesting. But nevertheless, I mean, solidarity obviously goes on to become an important term in the labor movement, regardless of where it comes from. Marx filters it in a way that's pretty interesting, even if not in a super detailed way. But I think what's really key in this essay, and what I think is really fascinating, is that Roediger is trying to kind of balance out the good with the bad, I guess, or the promise and the peril, maybe is a better way of putting it. That there's a promise being made when someone says solidarity, right? The promise that we are in this together, whether you're a communist or an anarchist or a unionist or whatever it might be, for Marx's time anyway. But at the same time, there are the perils when you start to abstract that in real social movements, by assuming that by saying the word solidarity, it's a sort of magic word, as Roediger says, that does away with all the difference, which I think is an important thing to just keep on harping on. Okay, thinking through this, Roediger is a historian. I mean, he's theorizing this, but he also does point us back to history. And I think that we could pull out a few examples. I mean, we've been talking about how solidarity is hard to achieve in maybe a contemporary moment, but Roediger points us to these earlier moments where there are these illustrative cases of what he's talking about, the challenges of solidarity, or the way that solidarity doesn't get achieved, all that kind of stuff. The contradictions in the labor movement, we might say.
Right.
Yeah, so he offers a lot of examples. He talks about, like, he has a really interesting reading of the Bacon Rebellion, which if you're into U.S. history, Roediger has a really neat way of talking about that. One that we kind of thought we'd talk about, because it's really fascinating, is the support of the labor movement for what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's a quote that kind of sets this up where Roediger says, "To imagine ourselves in solidarity with social movements of the past challenges us to remember them as presenting both ways forward and ways in which broad solidarities have often been elusive and difficult." So, he's saying as a historian, we should learn from the past, but we should learn from it in a sort of critical way. So Roediger turns to talk about the Knights of Labor, which were a like fraternal organization that turned out to be kind of a big deal labor union in the 19th century. They are responsible for all the labor slogans that you still hear today, like "an injury to one is an injury for all," or "to all." They had a lot of interesting things too. They the Knights of Labor are really wild because not in addition to like doing strikes and stuff, they also had like choirs and like sports halls. Just like a really interesting kind of phenomenon. Anyway, in spite of all that good stuff that they did do, they also did some very bad stuff, including supporting the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was signed in 1882 that excluded Chinese workers from the U.S., which they supported on the grounds that, I mean, first of all, racist grounds, but also the grounds that they like took away their jobs. Anything you want to say about that example, Matt? Anything that really strikes you about how Roediger pulls that out?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. The Knights of Labor were not something I knew a ton about, other than just some basic information. And I think Roediger helps kind of explain exactly like sort of the problem with them. I guess I've heard people talk about Knights of Labor in different contexts and like sort of the history of the labor movement, and like they seem like important things and an important group. But Roediger like talks about the Chinese Exclusion Act with regard to the Knights of Labor in a really important way. He says this: "An important part of the labor movement was built not despite a commitment to anti-Chinese racism, but through such a commitment." So I guess what's important about the Knights of Labor and their support of the Chinese Exclusion Act was that it's not just like an accident that they did that. It's something that they did because like that was part of building their movement. Building worker power at that moment, I guess, meant appealing to white supremacist sentiments. And that sucks, I guess, is what we can say about it, right? But like going back to that quote from Roediger a second ago, I think it kind of fits. That is a moment that we can understand with a lot of criticism, like important criticism. Like that is obviously bad, right? You, you can't really say an injury to one is an injury to all if you don't actually mean all. And Roediger has this interesting thing too that links back to like the Knights of Labor, more like fraternal vibe at the beginning, which, if you say an injury to one is an injury to all in the context of like a fraternal order, it might mean something different than like universal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But just the same, like, I guess this is a good thing to take a look at, that like this is the way that labor like built itself in the United States, and like we still see some of these things kind of play out, right? That there are these like conservative and reactionary elements to labor in certain places that will prize the labor and the value and the dignity of some workers over others, and
Hmm.
that's not solidarity. That's just being a white supremacist.
Yeah, or even like the way that people, certain prominent voices in the labor movement or in like left discourse or whatever, will play off certain demands made by like social movements as being not palatable for like the working class, which is usually the imagination is like the white working class in particular.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking of a particular incident that I won't go into the details of, but not too long ago, a certain podcast said something about how abolition, like prison abolition, is dumb, and how like people don't even know what they're talking about when they say it, and they sort of won't go out of their way to explain it to anybody. And on this particular podcast, it was a really ridiculous thing to hear because, first of all, abolitionists are always explaining stuff all the time. So it's sort of like this person telling on themselves a little bit about being like they don't do their homework. But also the subtext, of course, is like this is a ridiculous kind of demand and one that won't play. But in fact, like, prison abolition is certainly a radical thing to think. But in my experience, especially my experience as a person who talks to other people talking about organizing and all of that, it's not like the craziest thing you could ever tell somebody.
No.
Like, and there are a lot of people in the working class who are pretty ready to get down with it, right? So all that to say, this kind of problem of maybe privileging one imagined block of the working class over and against other members of the working class, and also over and against other people fighting for justice along anti-racist lines, let's say, is something that's unfortunately very alive and well in pretty prominent voices on the left.
Yeah, totally. That's a good example, I think, of how this works out, actually. I understand that you have a historical example as well, Dean.
Yeah, that's right. I do have a historical example. So, okay, we talked about, the Chinese Exclusion Act was 1882, and you might have thought, all right, well, hopefully, the labor movement got themselves together after that. Sorry to disappoint you. They super did not. And it comes out in a really, really interesting way in the story of George Washington Woodbey, who we've mentioned a few times on the show. He was a black pastor, Christian pastor, and also a member of the Socialist Party of America. He was the sole black delegate to its conventions in 1904 and 1908, I think. I should probably double check about that. But in any case, 2 conventions. In 1908 in particular, though, he addressed the problem of anti-Chinese labor in particular at the convention, and he was like one of the few voices to speak out against it. So I'll read a little bit of the speech that he gave, which is fascinating for a lot of reasons, but he says this: I'm in favor of throwing the entire world open to the inhabitants of the world. There are no foreigners and cannot be unless some person comes down from Mars or Jupiter or someplace. So apologies to the Martian labor movement. I stand on the declaration of Thomas Paine when he said, "The world is my country." It would be a curious state of affairs for immigrants or descendants of immigrants from Europe themselves to get control of affairs in this country and then say to the Oriental immigrants that they should not come here. That's his term, of course. So far as making this a mere matter of race, I disagree decidedly with the committee that we need any kind of committee to decide this matter from a scientific standpoint. We know what we think upon the question of race now, as well as we would know 2 years from now or any other time. And what I love about this is Woodbey is standing up for other workers, of course, but he's also doing it on the grounds that, like, the labor movement is just pretending that they don't know how to answer this question. as we just saw from talking about Roediger, 30 years before this, people were staunchly anti-immigrant and anti-Chinese immigrant in particular. And that was a way of building the labor movement, not assuming that was just like an unfortunate addendum or something. And I think it's important to pull examples like this out because it shows that people were actually struggling to build solidarity within those conditions, as horrible as they were. And Woodby is just a fascinating person in the history of labor who obviously embodies all of those things at the intersection of race, labor, and thinking about immigration and other forms of racism besides anti-Black racism in the labor movement. So all that to say, the labor movement didn't figure it out, but not for a long time anyway. And obviously not completely today, but it's great that there are these kind of counterexamples of people like Woodby who are actually trying to make solidarity difficult in important ways.
Yeah, Woodby is good. Woodby is goodby is what I'm going to say right now. That's my proclamation. Well, here's another example of solidarity and ways to like I guess understand the history critically and to just not paper over these things. Roediger goes on to give this other kind of interesting example of a sculpture in New York of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony having tea. It's a great sculpture, but there's some problems that Roediger points out. So he writes, the decades of their collaboration, also commemorated by their names, jointly gracing a spectacular bridge near the sculpture, richly deserve remembering. In an interview, the artist cast his own role in producing the work and its subject matter as exemplifying U.S. democracy at its best. All of that granted, the installation implies an ease in solidarity that the lives of Douglas and Anthony both exemplify and contradict. Their long and fruitful collaborations before and during the Civil War ought to be recalled, but so too should the fact that in the immediate post-war years, when the questions of African American and women's rights emerged with unprecedented intensity, bitter political splits utterly divided the two leaders. To insist that school children who visit the park would benefit from knowing both stories is not to depreciate the plain heroism and the capacity for alliance Anthony and Douglas often displayed. Nevertheless, profound structural differences in the ways in which the African American men and middle class white women experience both misery and the possibilities for redress left them in different and even opposing organizations. To understand the power of those pressures working against solidarity is also a usable part of remembering the past, alerting us to structural differences between forms of domination in the present, and allowing activists to know that not all fallings out of coalition are the result of bad faith. Okay. That's a really cool, a cool history, a cool story, a cool complication to put us at unease with solidarity. That, okay, Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, kind of known for having these like moments of collaboration, and that's very cool and very good, and we should celebrate that and learn from that whenever we can. But also, like, there were times when they didn't, and they were at odds, and they opposed one another and kind of fell out of favor with one another. And that's also like an important part of the story. Like, it is like maybe it's more depressing or like it's not as cool of a story because it doesn't sort of like highlight the way that these two people like work together or something. But I think it's important to understand that like inevitably there will be times when people who, both want the same things, right? Like, who both want like dignity and equality and that kind of thing. The people that want the same things will end up being on opposite sides of the conversation. And I think that's also good too, that like you don't have to pretend that you are in solidarity with other people when you really aren't. Because to do so is a disservice to the movement that you're in and the movement the other person is in. To pretend to have solidarity is bad as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And even that note that Roediger says that not all fallings out of a coalition are the result of bad faith, I think is really important, right? That you can have a good faith disagreement about how to strategically achieve something that might push you apart, right? Like Anthony and Douglas disagreed over strategies to get suffrage, right? The question being, should you focus on race or gender or both or whatever? And these kinds of issues divided them in ways that just make solidarity really tough. Like if you read the sort of history of that decision for them to part ways, you can sort of understand why both of those individuals felt the need to I don't know, like split on these particular issues and focus on their own fight for a while. And at the same time, you can see that that split also made solidarity between like the struggle for racial justice and the struggle for gendered justice and justice for women in particular very difficult, because if you start playing these two sides off against each other, you reproduce things like sexism or racism within respective movements, and that's what we saw in those movements as well. So I think it's just like it's a really instructive example of how you should see these disagreements as good faith disagreements that nevertheless create real problems, and also you should, as he says, avoid the sort of temptation to see this as like U.S. democracy at its best, to have these two individuals enjoying some tea, knowing all the while that eventually they're not going to be doing that.
Yeah, I think it's good. It's a good lesson to learn.
Well, okay. So here's the thing about critical studies: they can bum you out, right? Solidarity is a great word. Everybody wants it. Some people want to name a whole political party after it. We all want solidarity. But Roediger is trying to say it's a lot easier said than done. And not only that, if you say it too easily, you will not even do it. It will stop you from doing it. And I don't know, Matt, how do you sort of respond to something like that? Or how does that make you, how do you process that as a person on the left?
It's frustrating. I wish it was just as easy as saying it. That'd be great. But I think that makes some sense. That if it's just an easy thing to say, you don't really have any skin in the game, then yeah, it would be hard to actually achieve. But if you're just saying it, but I think it's a good thing to kind of safeguard ourselves against, right? Like there are plenty of people in the world who are already like willing to just say that they're in solidarity with this, or they're willing to say Black Lives Matter, or they're willing to take a knee or whatever, and they don't mean it. It's done in bad faith. There are too many of those people already. So I think people on the left need to figure out like how to actually express solidarity in some kind of meaningful way, so that it doesn't just fall into sort of like the sea of bad faith corporations saying that they care about Black lives or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. And not only that, but even thinking of the ways that people on the left, like we were just saying, sort of privilege imagined constituencies over and against others in ways that are really pervasive. The story I mentioned earlier is one example. You can see a lot of others, I think, when like people on the left get really obsessed with, I don't know, like not alienating white workers over talking about Black issues or something like that. Or people will say things like, you're never going to get like a rural white person to like accept this or that demand unless you frame it in a way that, I don't know, makes like appeals to their most reactionary parts of their nature or something. Or, these kinds of things that sometimes feel more like trolling than actually trying to get anything done. I think one of my biggest like frustrations in the left discourse is people who will say things like racism is real, but at the end of the day, all you have to do is think about class, and that's it. If you just think about class, you can kind of solve all the problems at once. I think what Roediger does is actually to say that, hey, if you want to build class solidarity, then you better work hard to build solidarity across like racial lines and many others. Otherwise, you're never going to have class solidarity, and you can't do that by pretending that every issue is actually secretly a class issue. Now that I think about it, that is something that Amoria says in the intro to this podcast every single week. So I guess you're familiar with the idea already. But it's a very good point, and one that people should keep talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think so. The other thing here too, this is the opposite point that I guess we're trying to make too, is that learning how to disagree is probably a good idea. The left is at this point extremely coalitional, right? Like everything is like someone's weird group working with someone else's weird group, or one campaign working with another campaign or whatever. Like the left is like this weird tapestry of things. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And like it is super easy just to like flippantly say that we like solidarity amongst one another, but like I think sometimes there are, I don't know, just like in the example of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony or whatever, differences in strategy, and I think it's a really good idea to learn how to disagree with one another in ways that are like, this is another loaded term, but comradely.
Yeah, sure.
You know what I mean? It's really important that solidarity forms, and we want to have the right types of solidarity, and we want to form like the right ways, and not just like say it to say it or whatever. But it's also like it's you don't want to underestimate how important and productive disagreeing can be, and
Mm-hmm.
not being in solidarity with one another. I guess not.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the wrong way of thinking about it. But like having a good disagreement that actually like means something rather than just like trying to throw one another under the bus or whatever.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I feel too like it's important to see solidarity as something that you achieve, like we said earlier, right? That and sometimes the only way to do that also is being willing to like be honest about your disagreements, such that you
Yeah.
can sort of hash them out. Because if you pretend they're not there, or you pretend that everybody's actually harmonious, I mean, what a way to destroy any attempt to build any real unity.
hmm Yeah, exactly.
Well, Roediger has I think, a really good conclusion here. I'll just read it and then we can sort of talk it through as we wrap it up. So he says, warnings against easy optimisms are far from calls for quietism. Instead, they reflect on the extent to which the desire for reassurances that social motion is proceeding in our favor can lead in practice to immobilization, especially when defeats accumulate and hollow victories are extolled. They urge that we realize what are up against and how uneasy the road ahead is bound to be. We ought to be willing to make solidarity uneasy as well, seeking it by owning its difficulties.
Hmm.
And I think that's just a great way to put it, that you'll only get solidarity if you recognize that it's hard to get. And I think that shouldn't like paralyze you from acting, but on the contrary, it should motivate you to act in such a way that you're, ready to mess up and ready to be told that you're messing up, and receiving those kinds of criticisms or making those kinds of observations, all in the interest of actually building solidarity rather than trying to, I don't know, protect your particular vision of how the left ought to be or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I mean, like the historical aspect of it means that you kind of have to become a little bit disenchanted from some of like the romance of some of those really cool labor stories. Or like, like
Mm-hmm.
Bacon's Rebellion is like I know we didn't talk about it very much, but like it's one of those stories that's like, and this is exactly why uh black workers and white workers should work together against like the ruling class or whatever. But taking that unease demonstrates the way that um it's just like way more complicated, and those stories they don't always they don't always line up with our fantasies of them or our
Mm-hmm.
interpretations of them or whatever. But I think it's actually helpful to kind of be, I don't know, not cynical, but to be uneasy about them,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't know. I mean, like to know that other people failed is good because it might let you know that you'll fail too, and that that you could be open to it. You could be open to understanding, but also not maybe not fail in the same way, which would be very positive. To fail in a whole new way would be great.
Yeah, right. Yeah, to not repeat those mistakes but make better ones is a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. I guess like that's a theme that we keep coming up against on Magnificast. That's like the theme of 2019, the theme of 2020 for sure, is failing in new ways that might be better.
Yeah.
But I think that's true of solidarity, right? Like you might end up doing the opposite of solidarity if you don't quite get it right. And I mean that's bad. Obviously, you don't want that to happen, but being like open to that criticism I think is really important, and understanding that like I don't know, it's not like you're gonna get it just right anyways, and like and win everything all at once. So being open to failing is like, I guess, I think the left kind of needs.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't spend too much time on the Christian angle this time around, but I think we've criticized there are bad Christian ways to understand solidarity, but I think there's a great line where Herbert McCabe says in the Class Struggle in Christian Love that being a Christian should make you a good comrade. And I think, for those of us that are still in the Christian tradition, like me, and trying my best to figure out how to be a good Christian and make that work for me and make myself work for it or whatever, that kind of line helps me to reflect on things like, all right, what is it about being a Christian that I hope could actually make me feel okay with the uneasiness of solidarity? And I think that that's where you can find maybe some spiritual tools to help you out, right? To allow yourself to be humble in the face of that kind of criticism, allow yourself to be for the other person and your neighbor as a person who you trust and, you know, want to lift up. And like, as the Bible says, insofar as it depends on you, don't be in conflict with anybody within the labor movement. That's the asterisk that Paul forgot to add on in that verse. So I think, you know, it's important to sort of think through how not only does Christianity kind of mess this up, but it can be I hope anyway, some kind of repository of tools and strategies that make you a better comrade, able to deal with the uneasiness of solidarity.
There we go. Nailed it. Got that good Christian stuff right at the end.
Yeah, that's how you do it. You got to get it in right at the end, right at the end of the wire, the end of the line, right before all the kids are about to lose focus. You hit them with that altar call and find out who's still awake.
We're all going to be at the altar, crying our eyes out. It's so important. It's Thursday night at camp, and we're doing it. That's a church camp reference, and only if you've been at church camp will you know what Thursday night camp is like.
We veered into very dangerous territory, so I think we have to stop it there.
That's right.
But build solidarity and also know that you're going to mess it up.
That's right. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. This is the part of the episode that's like the end of Saturday Night Live, and everyone's on stage. We're all waving.
I got that saxophone.
That's right. Jason Sudeikis is here. He was on the show. Wasn't he great? Keenan's giving everyone a hug. It's so good. And
can you believe Larry David's out there in the audience? I didn't even see him in the beginning.
He's just hiding out there the whole time. Well, if you liked this episode and these Saturday Night Live references, then you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can also leave us an iTunes review, which should be great. We don't get a lot of them these days. They're slowing down. After a few years of doing this podcast, people are giving us less, and you know what? Fine, but you could do it anyways. It'd be really cool. Great.
Give us 2.
Yeah, that's right. Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. And we'll see you next time.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.